Hello everyone, my name is Matt Olszewski and today I will be talking about my senior independent study. My study examined the effects of masculinity and attachment style on the perceptions of school shooters and the prevention of school shootings. I recruited a total of 164 participants for my study, most of whom were students at the College of Worcester and a few who were not students at Worcester and were above the age of 22 years old. So for my abstract, the age range of my participants went up to 30 years old. However, most of my participants were between the ages of 18 and 22 years old, and pretty much all of them went to the College of Worcester or are currently at the College of Worcester. For my measures, I used an 18-item scale called the Adult Attachment Scale. I used a 10-item masculinity contingency scale, and 5 open-ended questions regarding perceptions on the typical school shooter and how to prevent school shootings. Together, these measures that I used, I feel like strongly gave me a good idea of what were things that affected perceptions towards school shooters and school shootings and the prevention of these horrific acts. And I liked how I was able to incorporate the open-ended questions at the end of my survey for participants because it gave them a sense of freedom in order to be able to express their own ideas and opinions towards school shooters and school shootings. And also, I found that there is a strong desire to preserve masculinity in men, so they'll be more likely to reject emotional experiences because they feel like they're feminine. They'll be more likely to repress certain emotions that they feel are weak. They don't want to be wimpy. Versus women are normally more likely to do these things because they don't possess that kind of innate desire to preserve their masculinity. So through this preservation of masculinity, perceptions towards these controversial issues in people, meaning school shooters and school shootings, these perceptions from these individuals can be blurred and affected negatively through this desire to preserve masculinity. And also, unhealthy attachment style can contribute to toxic masculinity. For example, someone who's insecure may be more likely to exhibit toxic masculinity and act differently. For the next slide, what interested me, I became interested in this topic because of my awareness of toxic masculinity being alive and, unfortunately, easily thriving in society today. In addition, I knew how common school shootings were and how common mass violence has become over the last several decades. Previous research has not actually focused much on the reasons and motives behind these horrific and tragic acts of violence, but I want to examine more about that and how, dependent on someone's masculinity and attachment style, how their judgments and perceptions towards these controversial and very violent issues might be caused, and how those perceptions can be affected. So obviously there's a lot to uncover with regards to why certain individuals decide to shoot up a school, and what contributes to them becoming violent in the first place. So in order to dig deeper and find out more about this, I decided to focus on factors that influence people's perceptions of school shooters and the prevention of these acts of violence. In turn, I hoped I would be able to draw some conclusions with regards to what seems to be some of the main factors contributing to these acts of violence and affecting these individuals. And I wanted to, as I described before, I wanted to kind of add on to previous research and also kind of build a foundation for possible future research in this realm in order to make the world a better place, a safer place, a world where we can be more aware of why perceptions come about and what can affect them. So, in terms of the pertinence of my project to previous classes, my topic not only came from my interest from watching the news and my prior knowledge, but also the classes I took at Worcester have also made me think more critically about specific prevalent issues in the world today, such as toxic masculinity and the dramatic effects that attachment style can also have on an individual and their motives and decisions. I'm currently taking a class on attachment. The only reason why I didn't include that class here is because I haven't finished the class, but I do obviously think that that class has kind of tied into my IS in some ways, but I started my IS in August, so I haven't really used everything that I've learned from that attachment style class, because that class just started in January. Specifically, though, sociology of gender and applied psychology are the two classes that come to mind for being the more prominent classes that have kind of driven me in this direction and kind of made me think more deeply about my IS and what I wanted to do in the first place, because I was pretty unsure for a while. But I feel like a lot of the issues that we've talked about in those classes are super prevalent in society today, and I wanted to dig deeper for my project and examine the relationship between masculinity and attachment style and how those can affect people's perceptions of very heavy and controversial issues like school shooters and school shootings. So for my study design and methods, as I said before, I used 2 surveys and then 5 open response questions that had no minimum or maximum length requirement. So I mentioned the scales I used earlier on in my presentation, but I wanted to talk a little more specifically about them. For the adult attachment style scale, 2 examples of questions were: I find it relatively easy to get close to people, and I often wonder whether people really care about me. This scale allowed me to identify the attachment style of each participant based on their answers to the 18 Likert scale questions. So each question had, it was a Likert scale question. It had 5 different choices, starting from like I strongly disagree to I strongly agree, and then 3 was pretty much neutral, like I strongly disagree nor strongly agree. So that was how my scales worked in terms of like the Likert scale part of the questions. Obviously each question was different, but they were all on the same type of Likert scale. For the masculinity contingency scale, I used this measure to examine the extent to which each participant's self-worth was derived from their sense of masculinity, so it gave me a better sense of who was masculine, who wasn't, who was more masculine than other people, etc. Some of these questions included: my self-esteem gets a boost if I feel macho, and I would feel worthless if I acted like less than a man. So this is another scale which was crucial to me, gaining more information about the participants so I could kind of relate their perceptions to their attachment style and masculinity level, and the type of masculinity, obviously, because some masculinity is healthy, some isn't. My study was looking to examine the effects of unhealthy masculinity on perceptions that people possessed relating to school shooters and school shootings. And then lastly, my open response questions were, they had no maximum, no minimum length for the requirement, and these open response questions certainly gave me a better idea about participants' own perceptions toward these important issues. They allowed me to figure out more about participants, and each subject had their own chance to express their thoughts in as little or as much detail as they wanted. And they were a nice complement. These answers were a nice complement to the design surveys that participants completed. I did have a few problems I ran into during my research. The 2 most prominent obstacles, I would say, were that, number 1, a handful of participants didn't answer some of the open response questions and some of the survey questions, so they just personally either didn't feel comfortable, or maybe they were just rushing through the study, whatever it was. But for the most part, a lot of my participants gave really good answers, gave lots of nice details in the open response questions, and they completed all all of this survey questions, which was very beneficial to my study. The other problem I ran into was that I struggled to recruit participants outside of the College of Worcester. So the overwhelming majority of my participants were from Worcester, which was kind of a struggle at first. I had to kind of come to terms with that, but then I realized that Worcester's a very diverse student body, and I wasn't super worried about any bias or anything in my study. So for the next slide, my results and outcomes. So this is probably the more exciting part for a lot of people. As for my results, I had several significant results and some insignificant results. So first off, I found that individuals who are securely attached were more likely to score high on the closeness scale for attachment, which is pretty self-explanatory. I'm glad that my result held there and proved to be true. We also found that men scored higher on the masculinity contingency scale, which indicated that men were more likely to exhibit masculine traits and be seen as more masculine compared to female participants. Given that men exhibit these higher levels of masculinity, they were more likely to demonstrate toxic masculinity in different ways throughout their lives. So this was noticeable in the content analysis that I conducted. My first ever hypothesis was supported, which showed that liberals were more likely to acknowledge masculinity, attachment style, and political orientation as associations to a school shooter compared to conservatives and independents. So this was the hypothesis that I began to tie in political orientation. It was just a little variable that I added in. I know it wasn't the focus of my study, but I did want to examine it because I knew that there would likely be a relationship that could be illustrated between political orientation and possibly attachment style and masculinity. So my second hypothesis was also was not supported at first. My hypothesis stated that conservative men were more likely than women to be dismissive of school shooters being insecurely attached, highly masculine, and having a history of trauma such as mental illness. As I said, this was not supported. However, a content analysis that I conducted illustrated that there are very well-defined patterns that indicate conservatives plus men in general were less willing to say that these are traits associated with school shooters themselves. So this was just another finding that I kind of had to dig deeper in order to find a little bit more information about it and draw some more conclusions. So that's why I conducted the content analysis to look for trends. This was not as statistical analysis related as compared to using my SPSS program and running a bunch of tests on my data. This was more done by hand and conducted to examine possible trends. So that was that. For my third hypothesis, conservatives being more likely than liberals to be in support of teachers having guns in the classroom as a mode of defense was definitely significant. That was, again, one of those hypotheses that I kind of thought would be true, but, ended up holding true for sure. So in the case of a school shooting, more conservatives would be in support of teachers having guns to use as a mode of defense compared to liberals. So that was interesting. For my discussion section, before I go into that, I have a few different pictures to show here. This is showing that liberal men appear to be more likely to associate school shooters with social isolation. As you can see, the gray on the left-hand side, that big gray bar there. Here's the second bar graph that I included in my presentation. I had a total of 4 bar graphs, 2 for men, 2 for women, 1 for secure men, 1 for insecure men, 1 for secure women, 1 for insecure women. This bar graph is illustrating insecure men and shows that conservative men seem more likely to associate bad upbringing with school shooters, whereas liberal men, yet again, appear more likely to be associating isolation with school shooters. This is showing that liberals seem to be more likely to associate isolation, masculinity, and mental illness with school shooters compared to conservatives. This is for secure women. For insecure women, there is again a very tall bar for isolation. For liberal/insecure women, so liberals seem to be more likely to associate isolation, masculinity, and mental illness with school shooters compared to conservatives. And again, you see that prominent, tall, grayish bar, and then every other bar is a lot shorter than that. Moving on to the discussion part of my paper, I'd like to read one of my favorite quotes from that section. Through our observation of men being less likely than women to acknowledge isolation, lack of attachment style, mental illness, and masculinity as associations to school shooters, it seems as though men try to protect their image and not admit to a toxic trait they may possess, high toxic levels of masculinity. Men also tend to like to think of themselves being above women. Endorsing power over women is something that may help them feel powerful, efficacious, and be able to maintain their dominance. In other words, their toxic masculinity may have contributed to them attributing isolation and lack of attachment and mental illness as factors that are weak, embarrassing, and generally something they did not want to associate themselves with. This brings up the issue of masculinity also being about power relations amongst men, not only between men and women. These male participants were also less willing to acknowledge masculinity itself, because they may have realized that ignoring masculinity was another way to protect their self-image. So as you can see, the perceptions of these types of individuals are hindered due to the toxic traits that they may possess. It's very apparent that this is the case in my research, and there must be a shift in the narrative in terms of why men are thinking this way. Just because they're men, they shouldn't be ignoring toxic traits in individuals. They should still be able to perceive something as wrong, just like a woman would be able to. There's a definite change between men and women when it comes to perceptions towards some crucial issues. Preserving an individual's sense of masculinity seems very important to men. My findings from my study add on to previous research regarding toxic masculinity ideals and how men tend to reject certain emotional experiences and feelings as feminine. Our general findings suggest that the higher levels of masculinity and insecure attachment in an individual can definitely negatively impact their ability to acknowledge traits that are seen as controversial in many ways. Political orientation and gender are two things that only compile onto these effects and can even more heavily impact individuals' perceptions towards school shooters, school shootings, and the prevention of these horrific events. We need to shift our focus away from just guns and shooters and focus more on the underlying issues that cause these events to take place, such as mental illness, attachment style, previous trauma, masculinity, and political orientation. As my research shows, there are many factors we can focus on that do in fact affect people's perceptions towards school shooters and the prevention of school shootings. As people know, these events are very important to focus on. I personally believe that there's not enough research being done on this realm of school shooters and school shootings. There's lots of factors that research should go into in order to make the world a better place, a safer place, and make living environments and school environments, learning environments in general, more safe for all students and teachers. No one should have to fear going into school in fear of a school shooter possibly coming into the school and shooting it up. Students should feel free and safe to breathe, live, learn without being in fear of a horrific event about to take place in the school. I'd like to thank my family, my friends, my professors over the last 4 years, and my IS advisor, Dr. Mike Casey, for all the help they have given me These past 4 years, all the guidance, all the comfort, support, and trust, I definitely wouldn't have been able to do this without them. It was definitely not easy at times, but I made it through, and I'm a better person because of it. If anyone has any questions or would like to read over a copy of my IS, please feel free to send me a message online or email me. Thanks so much for listening and stay safe.